On today's episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the Army is pulling the plug on its afloat prepositioning program. I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to today's episode. So, I just listened to a podcast the other day by the Commanding General of U.S. Army Forces in the Pacific. It was done with the Modern War Institute out at the U.S. Military Academy, a great institution. I had the opportunity to teach there for a year at West Point. Loved it. One of the best teaching experiences I've ever had. But on the Modern War Institute podcast, the Commanding General said this. Humans have this unique tendency to live on land. Decisions are made on land, nations exist, and their wealth exists on land, and the land has to be protected, and we help them do that. I think that is a perfectly fair assessment. I think he's exactly right. The role of the U.S. Army is absolutely essential for success in any military endeavor, and particularly in the Pacific. What we're looking at right now is the return to great power competition around the world. And one of those looming threats appears to be China, which has got everybody focused on the ability to project forces vast distances across the Pacific. Again, if you have to bring the U.S. Army from the continental United States all the way over to Asia, well, you're going to need to cross this big blue area here. I can't help but notice even Lego put a little boat in here. You're going to need a boat to get across. Now, the Army has experience with this. If you want to look at the third largest campaign in the U.S. Army's history, the first largest was the U.S. Army in Europe in World War II. The second was the U.S. Army in Europe in World War I. But the third largest was the U.S. Army in the Pacific. Historian John McManus just completed a 3-volume trilogy on this series. I heartily recommend it. These are great books. McManus did a epic job in documenting the role of the U.S. Army in the Pacific. However, one of the themes that keeps coming across in that book is you kind of need boats to get across the ocean here. And yet, one of the things the Army has just announced, or actually not officially announced, this is going on behind the scenes, the reason for the video today, is the Army wants to cut its afloat prepositioning program. What is the afloat prepositioning program? That's what we're going to talk about today. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. So to deploy U.S. forces overseas requires several elements, and one of them is what's referred to as sea lift. This is the military use of shipping, largely commercial shipping, but sometimes also government-owned shipping, in times of conflict. My doctoral dissertation is on the role of military sea lift from the Spanish-American War of 1898 all the way up to the Iraq War of 2003, so I know a little something about this topic. The way the U.S. accomplishes that is through something called the Sea Lift Trident. There are 3 legs to this Sea Lift Trident. The first leg is afloat prepositioning, which we're going to talk about today. The second leg is what's referred to as surge sea lift. And then the third element is sustainment shipping. And we're going to kind of work our way backwards through this to get ourselves to the afloat prepositioning. So sustainment shipping, what are we talking about here? Well, this is the commercial U.S. Merchant Marine, but the commercial U.S. Merchant Marine has shrunk in size. After the first Persian Gulf War of the early 1990s, the United States developed what was called the Maritime Security Program. Initially 47 ships, it has now since expanded to 60 ships, including a cable security fleet, which consists of 2 vessels, and a new tanker security program that's not listed on this chart of 10 vessels. And so the tanker security program and the maritime security program brings vessels into the U.S. registry. Most of these vessels are foreign built, but they're U.S. flagged. And these ships would be essential for the transportation of sustainment goods to keep U.S. forces supplied. They also provide a pool of merchant mariners that can be used to not just crew these vessels, but also some vessels in the second fleet, and that is the Surge Sea Lift Fleet. Now, the Surge Sea Lift Fleet consists of about 53 vessels that are maintained in a reserve status. They are scattered on the 3 coasts of the United States, the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Gulf Coast. Yes, I know Great Lakes, I'm not forgetting you, but we don't keep strategic sea lift vessels on the Great Lakes. So about a third on each of those 3 coasts. And these vessels have a minimum crew, about 1/3 of the crew necessary, about 9 to 10 people on board out of a crew of about 30. It takes 5 days to activate these vessels, and then they can sail to a port of embarkation, load equipment, and sail overseas. The problem is that these ships are old. The numbers on there indicate how old they are. Yes, that is the age of the vessels. You're talking about ships on average that are over 45 years of age. So these are really old vessels. Not only that, there's a severe readiness problem with these ships. They're supposed to be 85% of the ships are supposed to be available at any one time. They are below that level. There was a big test in 2019 and they only hit 40%. It's gone up since then, but there's a big question mark about whether or not these ships would truly be available. Add to it that these ships take time to load, equip, and you have to draw crews from the commercial operating fleet. And there's a big question whether or not there will be sufficient mariners for these vessels. That brings us to prepositioning. Now, in prepositioning, there's two different types of prepositioning. There's shore-based prepositioning, and then there is a float prepositioning. This came from a CRS, a Congressional Research Services publication, which I'll have the link in the show notes, showing where prepositioning sites are around the world. The U.S. Marine Corps maintains 3 prepositioning sites. One's in Norway, and then 2 are afloat. We'll talk about those in a minute. The Army has a series of 7 Army prepositioning sites around the world, from the United States over to Europe, to afloat, which is called APS-3, to the Far East, South Korea and Japan, to the Middle East, to South America, and to Africa. And so they maintain them. And then the U.S. Air Force actually has the largest group, about 23 different sites scattered around the world. So a pretty large and extensive prepositioning presence. Now, the afloat prepositioning program has been around for a long time. It has been around. I'm going to talk about the history here in a minute. But right now, what the U.S. Army maintains is a fleet of 8 vessels, 7 of which are forward deployed. 6 of them are what's known as large medium speed roll-on roll-off vessels, LMSRs. Got to have an acronym for everything. These were ships that were built or converted after the first Persian Gulf War, so they're getting a little long in the tooth now. They're about 20 years old, the new ones. The Army maintains about 5 of them active, and then 2 chartered container ships. And the roll-on, roll-off ships contain all the equipment for an Army brigade, an infantry brigade combat team, along with engineers, transportation elements, hospitals. It's a slew of gear. It's a lot. And then the container ships carry a lot of the sustainment needed, food, ammunition, a lot of gear is sustained on them. And this fleet of vessels has decreased in size over the years. At the time of the first Persian Gulf War, the Army maintained a fleet of about 4 ships, largely cargo vessels, but also a port opening package. And the port opening package was a very interesting element. It allowed you, for example, to build something like, I don't know, the pier in Gaza. You didn't have to sail all the way from Virginia over to Israel and Gaza, for example. You had this stuff afloat and stored on vessels, either in the Indian Ocean or in forward depots in Japan or England. Kind of got rid of those because we fought a 20-year war in Central Asia, which required us to kind of cut back on things. So where we had this huge, extensive port opening package, now we not only got rid of it, but we were planning to get rid of it entirely in 2019, but that changed. And now the Army is scrambling to try to put this pier together off the coast of Gaza. It's taken 2 months now, and we're still not quite done doing that yet. But the Army fleet is a really extensive fleet. Now, some people will sit there and say, well, you don't need to have that Army gear on ships. You can put it ashore, which is exactly true. Again, go back to our idea of putting it on the land. For example, you can take the gear off the floating ships and put it in Europe, put it in Korea, and there you go. It's cheaper and more efficient to put it ashore. Problem is if you have to move it and you're not in the site where your gear is. That's always the problem. And one of the things that APS-3, which is the Army storage site afloat, has done is it gives you a lot of versatility. Now, some of you will be sitting there saying, hang on, Sal, have you heard of airplanes? I have. I heard they're a new invention coming out. I'm not big into them. I like ships. But I've heard airplanes. And, why not stick an M1 tank on a C-17 and you can fly it in? That is more efficient. Well, have you actually seen an Army brigade? An Army brigade is kind of big. Excuse me. That seems like a lot of vehicles because it's not just the tank. It's the support vehicles. It's the sustainment. It is the ammunition. It is a lot. What? I'm sorry. There's more. Yes, that is a full Army laydown brigade. That's what we're talking about being carried across 5 vessels. This is a large footprint. It takes a lot to put that full brigade on. Can we get that? Yeah, thank you. That's a lot. It's a lot of equipment that we're talking about there. You can fly it in on a C-17, but you better have a buttload of C-17s, and you're going to use them all to try to fly this in. And again, that's not even including the fuel and the ammunition. So one of the reasons why we have these ships is because we want them to be able to deploy. And matter of fact, what we've seen is how useful they are. Back in 1990, when the Persian Gulf War happened, one of the things we found out was this concept worked. Now, the concept of float prepositioning is really old. Actually goes back to 1963 when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had 3 ships broken out of the National Defense Reserve Fleet, 3 Victory ships. These were called floating forward depots. He loaded them with a battalion-sized task force on each ship. And these 3 ships, they were the USNS Provo, the Cheyenne, and the Phoenix, were loaded out and stationed in Subic Bay. And the plan was actually to have 19 of these ships scattered around the world. Well, didn't happen because of the Vietnam War. But the program was resurrected in the late 1970s, early 1980s with the creation of the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, what becomes U.S. Central Command. The idea is we need to have a force that can be landed very quickly in areas around the world. And so the Marine Corps bought into this with what was called the Maritime Prepositioning Force, or the MPF. And the MPF had a whole slew of vessels. They planned to build 14 security class vessels, but what they wound up doing was converting 8 ships and building 5 of what became the MPF vessels. And these ships were stationed in 3 squadrons, one initially on the east coast of the U.S., later moved to the Mediterranean, one at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, and then one out in the Western Pacific. And these 13 ships were absolutely essential at times. Matter of fact, they landed the first heavy equipment in Saudi Arabia in 1990. They landed forces in Kuwait in 2003. They were used in Somalia. They were used in a host of relief operations around the world. They were a massive force multiplier for the Marine Corps. And their success in the Persian Gulf War of 1990-91 led to the idea that we want to build more of these ships. And so the Marine Corps built what was called Marine Corps MPF enhancement vessels, but the Army bought into this program, and the Army wanted to put an entire brigade afloat. When I left sailing, I went to go work for Military Sealift Command headquarters, and my first job working for them was first as the operations officer for the Marine Corps program, but then I did the Army afloat prepositioning program. And to build the Army afloat prepositioning program, which was eventually going to consist of 16 vessels with 2 million square feet of cargo, 4 container ships, a port opening package, we had to build new ships. And this is where the large, medium speed roll-on, roll-off vessels, you can kind of see the very similarity between the LMSR concept and the MPF concept there. And the LMSRs and the afloat prepositioning worked great. Matter of fact, in 2003, it was the arrival of the LMSRs in Ashabaya and Kuwait that allowed the first deployments of the U.S. Army. We actually, under the guise of an exercise, offloaded the Army Brigade in Kuwait. This became one of the first brigades of the 3rd Infantry Division. And then those ships went to the shoreside facilities that were storing another brigade set. This was in Qatar or Qatar, loaded it up and brought it to Kuwait. So these ships actually deployed 2/3 of the 3rd Infantry Division to Kuwait in 2003, just demonstrating the fact that these ships were absolutely vital for the execution of a maritime strategy. But now what we're hearing is the Army wants to get rid of them. And there's a lot of reasons why the Army wants to curtail this program. Number one, it's expensive. To operate an LMSR is about $45 million a year. That's over $200 million to operate 5 of them, add to it 2 contracted container ships. And so obviously the cost is a big issue they want to get rid of. Now the Army is looking at what to do with this equipment. Will they take it back to the United States, offload in the United States? Will they spread the cargo out into shoreside facilities in Korea, Japan, the Middle East, Europe? We don't know yet. The Army is still in the process of doing this yet. But what we're seeing is some of the Army ships are returning back to the U.S. now, and they're starting the offload process. The reason the Army has 6 LMSRs is that 5 of them are forward deployed, and when one comes back, it offloads. The gear is refurbished at the old Naval Weapons Station, Charleston. This was taken over by the Army in the 1990s. And then the LMSR that has been laid up is broken out, and so they're always swapping out ships. So you always have a ship that's in a laydown period for a brief period of time undergoing a maintenance. Very smart program, by the way, what the Army developed. Well, the Army now is not going to send the ships back out. As the ships come in, they're not sending them back out. And we've seen this happening, by the way, with the Marine Corps, because the Marines have been doing the same exact thing. The Marine concept had been to have 3 squadrons stationed around the planet, one in the Mediterranean, one in the Indian Ocean, one in the Pacific. Well, each of those could support a Marine brigade of 16,000 troops. All you needed to do was add aircraft and Marines. It was kind of like instant Marine Expeditionary Brigade. Well, in 2012, they got rid of the Marine Brigade in the Mediterranean. This is the brigade, by the way, that had all those watercraft on board that are needed now off of Gaza. So ships like the Lopez, ships like the Bobo, which suffered its engine explosion, they would have been right there in the Mediterranean, able to offload and start this pier operation sooner than 2 months. So they were curtailed. And all the other assets were then scattered between the squadron in Diego Garcia and the Western Mediterranean. But since that time, over the past decade, that squadron has gotten smaller and smaller. There were supposed to be 7 ships in each squadron, but what we see today is that there's only 3 ships in each squadron, meaning that when the Commandant of the Marine Corps testified before Congress recently in a posture hearing, which I'm sure we all watched. I mean, I watch every posture hearing of all the combatant commanders and the heads of the armed forces. I mean, who doesn't watch that? Really need to get a life. General Smith, which first off, welcome back, General Smith. He had suffered a heart attack, so good to see the Commandant back up and around. Stated that the Marines still maintain 2 squadrons. Well, yes and no. There are 2 squadrons out there, but the squadrons are half the size of what they have been. So their capabilities only for 1 squadron out there. And so the ships are scattered between that area with very few vessels. And there's a big question about what are the Marine Corps going to do. The older, what they call legacy MPS vessels, these older vessels, I want to be referred to as a legacy historian from now on. But the older ships are being phased out. And what has happened is they've been sent back to the United States. They've been laid up. There hasn't been a lot of work done on their maintenance because the ships are going to be turned over from the Navy over to the Department of Transportation's Ready Reserve Force, and what has happened is the maintenance has lapsed. And how do I know that? The USNS Button had a massive engine room fire that required the flooding of the engine room with CO2. That ship is probably going to be scrapped because the engine room fire was devastating. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. And then you had USNS Bobo, which was sailing to Gaza when one of its 2 engines suffered a crankcase explosion. That ship had to limp back into Jacksonville, and now that cargo is being transloaded to another laid-up MPS ship, the Stockholm, that's going to take it out. So what the Army wants to do is get rid of its fleet. They want to phase out the Army fleet. They want to, as the ships come back in, turn the LMSRs back over to MSC. MSC is going to lay them up and then turn them over to MARAD. And then the container ships will go away. And the question is this the right course of action? Because these ships are a massive force multiplier. Now, I understand that the Army is talking about deploying these multi-domain task forces and raining fire down upon the Chinese from little island bases throughout the first island chain. And you may not need big, huge, massive 950-foot, 300,000 square foot roll-on, roll-off vessels sailing around. However, the bulk of the U.S. Army is right here. And if you have to move it overseas, you're going to need big boats. I cannot lie. They need them to move them. And by removing these ships, taking them out of service, you're not just merely reducing the ability of the combatant commanders, Indo-PACOM, CENTCOM, AFRICACOM, EUCOM, to deploy forces very quickly, which means this has to be taken at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level, by the way, because these are strategic assets. But you're also removing the ability for those ships to employ crews, to maintain a workforce in the industrial base, to do maintenance on them, and to provide the quick turnaround necessary. The idea here is the afloat prepositioning is landing forces and troops while the surge sea lift fleet is activating loading gear in the United States, sailing that way. And as it's arriving, the prepositioning fleet is heading back to go get the second wave of cargo. We saw that validated in the Persian Gulf of 1990 when we moved over 500,000 troops and their equipment in 7 months. We saw it during 2003 in the Iraq conflict when we moved the equipment for 175,000 troops in 3 to 4 months. And in a potential conflict, we'll see it. Now, yeah, I agree. Fighting in these little islands in the South China Sea, you're probably not going to need a whole armored brigade. But if you're going to defend an island, I don't know, like Taiwan or the Philippines, or reinforce Korea, Japan, or Guam, or some of our other island bases, you may need some heavy forces. You may need some large ships. And what we're doing by withdrawing the afloat prepositioning force is really reducing our readiness. Now, if that's the decision that's made, that's great, but it comes with ramifications, and I think there needs to be a discussion about it. I watched the posture hearings. I listened to all the posture hearings. I really need a life. There was no discussion about this at all. The Army chief didn't bring it up. The combatant commanders didn't bring this up. There was no discussion being done that the Army is withdrawing its afloat prepositioning force. And understand, I think this has been a problem. I think the drawdown in afloat prepositioning is a big issue. This is marine traffic showing you the location of the ships of the afloat prepositioning force. Now, this is open source. I'm not showing anything that's classified or secret. Go on marine traffic. You can pull up the automated information systems of the vessels. And you'll see vessels down here in Diego Garcia. You see them out here around Guam, Saipan. You can see them up and around Korea. You see some vessels deploying out. This is the Charlton coming from the west coast of the United States. The Lion, which is one of the 2 Air Force vessels off the coast of Portugal. You can see Lopez, which is one of the maritime prepositioning ships that was maintained in a reserve status, brought out for the Gaza. But if you head over here to the United States, one of the things you'll see is the vast majority of them are being laid up in and around the United States. You have one maritime prepositioning ship, the Sacagawea, that's sailing out right now to return back on station. This is one of the 3 ships of maritime prepositioning squadrons. But the vast majority of the ships are laid up. And what we're going to see here is the U.S. Army's fleet laid up. I think we need to be having this decision because one of the concepts that has been validated time and time again is afloat prepositioning. It provides you equipment up front. It provides you shipping. It provides a labor pool of mariners who are out there using their licenses, which can be used later on to staff and crew the surge fleet. It provides a part of the industrial base. It keeps ships up and running. This is a good all-around investment. It's expensive. This is the big drawback about it, and I think we need to have a discussion. Now, the question is, do we need 950-foot, 300,000 square foot large medium speed ro-ros out there? We may want smaller vessels out there, in which case we should be having that discussion. The thing we shouldn't do is withdraw the vessels and then have the discussion, because they are not having this discussion publicly right now, and it's not even being done quietly behind the scenes from what I'm hearing, and I hear from a lot of people. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button down below, or head on over to Patreon and become a monthly and yearly subscriber. Until our next video, this is Al, signing off.